for that. Hi, everyone. My name is Joe. I'm an engineer at Intersection. I work on the transit team. We're hiring. Um, and I also volunteer with Transportation Alternatives. They're a nonprofit focused on improving pedestrian and cycling space in the city. Um, they're also looking for volunteers. Um, Today, I want to talk about traffic violence, the role NYPD plays in it, and my journey of just trying to better understand that. So my initial inspiration for this idea, when Tyler brought this up, was actually talking about how uh, street design influences traffic violence, how wider streets lead to more crashes, and essentially how people are getting hurt because of bad design. But what I found was that a lot of what I was doing was manual. These pictures that I took were actually from me biking on Canal Street. Um, and I was spending a lot of time manually measuring lanes of streets, trying to come up with different statistics to show. Um, so that all quickly switched last month when I was working on this presentation, and a driver of this nice blue car here decided to drive on the wrong side of the road to pass a double parked car, and they hit me and squeezed me between a dumpster and their car, and then they drove away. No big deal. Oops. I chased them down. It, ultimately, what happened when I confronted them about hitting me with their car, asking them to pull over, he rolled down his window and said, "I didn't hit you. You scratched my car." So he refused to pull over, and I got tired of chasing him in Midtown Manhattan. So I ended up calling the police, filing a police report, and ultimately, that's what led me down this rabbit hole of trying to understand traffic enforcement in the city. Because when the police took my report, they did multiple things wrong, unsurprisingly. Um, and I had to go back to the precinct 4 different times just to get them to include the driver's information in the crash report. They refused to put it because they said they didn't witness the crash, even though I had evidence in a USB drive personally made just for them to view everything that happened from my bike, excuse me, from my bike camera. So this is actually what my crash report looked like, summarized through Crash Mapper, which is a uh, public website that basically pulls in all the NYPD collision information and maps it uh, through CartoDB. And you can see, even though I did say I was injured multiple times, they said that there were no injuries during this crash. So I bring that up because I think it's important before showing this, which is this is just an aggregate of all crashes that happened in the city just this year up until October. Um, and it's hard to tell because there's lots of injuries, but basically there's a yellow dot for no injury, a orange dot for injuries, and red dot for a fatality. And we can see that there's just a lot of them. Um, and one thing I want to bring attention to is actually uh, the contributing factors here. In my case, the contributing factor was unspecified. That's what happens when the police just don't really take the report on it. But the contributing factor under unspecified is driver inattention and distraction. And that's something as a cyclist in the city that's really interesting to me because most of the time when I'm biking past cars, I see that people are on their phones texting or watching movies while they're in traffic. It's not uncommon. um, and so I just want to point out, in case you can't see the numbers, a third of crashes, the contributing factor is driver inattention or distraction. And so basically knowing that led me to try and explore different ways to understand why so many people are distracted while driving. I know it's unrelated to my crash. My crash happened because negligence, but I feel like I'm doing a comedy skit. Sorry. um, yeah, so uh, going back to these crashes, I wanted to focus on distracted driving because I feel like that is pretty much the leading cause of most crashes. And so I was exploring different data sets, and what I stumbled across was the NYPD moving violation data set, which doesn't look like this. It actually, it's on their website. It has historical information since 2011, which basically you can download a zip file for a particular month, and you can open it up, and it will bring you to a folder that has over 100 files in it, one Excel file for every precinct and every borough. And it's basically a lot of data that is hard to go through. And that led me to actually create a script that would fix the data, because much of the data, like for several years, they would include multiple rows in one row in one specific column, or do things like add collision data to crash data. And there was a lot that had to be figured out there. So what I ended up doing was just creating a little repository, writing a few scripts that would go through these Excel files in the script folder, convert them to CSVs, and then normalize the data as I went along. The code is pretty bad. It was all done in one-off ways as a way, like parse CSVs 2014 and later, because the format kept changing. But ultimately, that was done so that I could create CSVs for every month. This is an example of what you would see when you downloaded a specific month. These are all the files. And then I also created a JSON aggregates folder. So basically for every precinct, this is going to update every month. So you can just see all the data for a specific precinct since 2011. But yeah, so after I worked on this, I realized like this is helpful for me and probably helpful for other people who want to do data analysis, but it's not really helpful for someone who just has an idea and wants to see like, well, what's happening in my precinct. So I just quickly spun up a quick proof of concept that just does some GET requests to fetch that aggregated JSON data and display it in a chart library. So what this is showing is actually the citywide moving violation since 2011. And you can see there's parts where it drops off. That's where the NYPD just didn't include data for some things. It's not my fault, I swear. And what you can do is actually focus on specific precincts or boroughs. What I like to do, and sorry, I'm crouching here, but I like to click through and look at how boroughs compare to each other in terms of enforcement. And so you can see stuff like this. This is Manhattan versus Brooklyn. Fairly consistent enforcement. And this is just for total moving violations. You can actually click through and look at things interesting like cell phone moving violations and see things like, you don't have to see the numbers here to see that it's pretty low now. And before it was never really high. But yeah, so that's a little recap on that. So going back to the presentation, oops. What I found interesting working on this project was that I could focus on things at a very small level happening in my neighborhood. And so I thought it would be helpful to focus not just on citywide stuff or borough-wide stuff, but focus on a street that's pretty, I hold it very closely in my heart because I had to commute on it for a year for work. Canal Street is a street that's just a mile in length, actually a little less than a mile. And it sees nearly 35 million cars per year just accessing the Holland Tunnel, eastbound and westbound. And it gets another several million from the Manhattan and Williamsburg bridges that are near it. And it averages close to 700 crashes per year. The first and the fifth, there's 3 precincts that are on or monitor Canal Street, the 1st, 5th, and 7th. And the 1st and the 5th see their worst crash stats on Canal Street, that one street. And the 7th sees its worst crash stats on the FDR. So that's not surprising either. One thing that's really interesting about Canal Street, though, is that, again, most of the contributing factors are from driver inattention and distraction. So just on this one strip, this one street, we have 5,400 crashes with 2,000 being attributed to driver inattention. And Canal Street is actually where I noticed people sit in traffic there for up to 2 hours a day, trying to get the free trip to Jersey. And I've seen multiple people on their phones, and I have a YouTube video showing it. So if you're interested in watching traffic. Yeah, so it just so happens I have the 1st and the 5th precincts crash stat or moving violation stats up here. And what I want to point out is that this is the total moving, yes, it is the total moving violations that were written. And it's remained fairly consistent over time, which is to say that it hasn't really been helping because the amount of crashes happening just in that area alone has been going up. But one thing I want to point out is that for cell phone moving violations, there's a pretty sharp drop, especially with the 1st precinct. And when we look at this chart, we see at the peak, the 1st precinct gave about 289 cell phone moving violations in 1 month, which, going back to how there's at least 35 million cars per year accessing Canal Street, that's not really a high number, but it's something. But more recently, when we look at this, the amount of moving violations given goes down to 52 for the 1st precinct and 5 for the 5th. And I found that pretty interesting to look at. And I wanted to use that as a base to basically understand, like, is there a correlation between crashes that happen and the due to distracted driving and the moving violations that are written for cell phone use. So just looking at these numbers and looking at these timelines, I decided to pick some years. So 2012 to 2013 was around when the peak amount of moving violations were being given out for cell phone use. And there were close to 1,200 crashes, with 336 being attributed to driver inattention/distraction. Fast forward to 2017, 2018, 30% more traffic, more crashes. So nearly 1,600 crashes, with 716 being attributed to driver inattention and distraction. So this is when there was a sharp decrease in violations being written. So correlation does not mean causation, and I still think the amount of moving violations they wrote back at their peak was very low for this area. But this is just one little piece to the puzzle, and I think if you're interested in looking at this data and stitching things together, this tool could be very valuable to you. And so I talked a bit about Canal. I said I volunteer with Transportation Alternatives. We have a petition up to help improve the pedestrian space on Canal. If you want to sign the petition, it's transalt.org/fixcanal, or you can scan the QR code. And that's it.